Welcome to the entire Bible for everybody from atheist to Christian believers. This is session number 5, Introduction to the Old Testament. Explaining the Old Testament is difficult, especially explaining the Old Testament to everybody from atheists to Christian believers. Some of the scientific and scholarly information may come as a surprise to many Christian believers. Here are the assigned readings for session number 5, Introduction to the Old Testament. Welcome to the entire Bible for everybody, from atheist to Christian believers. This is session 5, Introduction to the Old Testament. And that's me. And section 5, October 30th. This course is based on a theory of what modern people want to know about the Bible. What the Bible really says, the message, and that's in the assigned readings, and the Bible explained in modern language, which is the language of science, what is, quote, true, unquote. And the course consists of an overview, which was session 1, and then the Bible divided into 8 sections, 4 New Testament, 4 Old Testament, each section with assigned readings and a lecture to hopefully explain it. And here are the 9 sessions. The overview, the New Testament Gospels, Acts and Paul, New Testament Paul, and this is where we are today, the intro to the Old Testament. And then we're going to do next week the Old Testament monarchy, about the kings of Israel, and then the Old Testament about the prophets of Israel, and finally the Second Temple period, and then the summary of the New Testament. This is where we're at right now. Why is the Old Testament so important? That's the question we're going to be asking. And in session 1, we showed the tremendous growth of Christianity from the time of Jesus by centuries. You've seen this enough times. From 0 to 8,000, 150,000, 3 million, 25 million. And finally, today, this is actually 2022, Christianity with 2.38 billion people, and Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. But I was asked about Judaism, so I added it here. Judaism, 14 million, 0.2%. Now, that may sound very small for Judaism comparatively, but these are the 5 world religions. If you ask anybody in academics, these are the 5. And Judaism may be small, but very important, because both Christianity and Islam are closely related to Judaism. Judaism, Christianity, Islam all recognize Abraham as, quote, Father Abraham. They are Abrahamic religions. So this is session 5, the Introduction to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures of Judaism. And there's again where we are in the course right now. The Old Testament is about what I sometimes call the 3 M's: monotheism, morality, and prophecy about a coming Messiah. Judaism deserves high praise from Christians for its message about monotheism, morality, and the Messiah. Nobody should look down on Judaism as being unworthy. It is very important. And ancient Judaism solved the 2 biggest challenges of any religion, monotheism and morality, and laid the groundwork for the understanding of the Messiah. Judaism and Christianity agree about monotheism and morality. They have different ideas about the, quote, Messiah. Christian believers believe the Messiah has come already and his name is Jesus. Jewish believers believe the Messiah has not come yet and still wait for his coming. Both Jewish believers and Christian believers expect a resurrection of the dead at the end of time. Christians would call it the second coming. The most important historical date is the nation-state of ancient Israel about 1000 BC. And that was King David. There's a picture of King David. And that is now a solid historical date. Why do I stress that? Because it's a solid historical date for the nation-state of ancient Israel and for a dynastic king of Israel named David. Dynastic means he had a dynasty of people who were his direct descendants, and all of the kings of Israel are his direct descendants, all the way down to Jesus. That's why there's a genealogy going all the way from David to Jesus. Almost everything in the Bible before 1000 BC is controversial according to modern biblical archaeology, modern science. Everything before 1000 is a little iffy. Controversies about the Bible, this old part of the Bible. There are two diametrically opposing views which are known in archaeology as the maximalists and the minimalists. The maximalists believe every single word in the Bible is true. They are the literalists. The minimalists believe nothing in the Bible is true. They are the extreme skeptics. I think both approaches should be tolerated with respect, but when we do science, we have to figure out what's true according to scientific and historical principles. That's what I'm doing in this course. Now I'm going to talk about monotheism and morality. The Old Testament's understanding of monotheism prepared the way for Jesus, who's 1,000 years later, right? And it meant that Jesus did not have to fight against polytheism in the land he called home, which was Judea. All that work had been done for him. So even though in the time of Jesus, most of the world was polytheistic, right? Jesus came to Judea, which was monotheistic. And he didn't need to worry about fighting polytheism. Similarly, morality. The Old Testament's understanding of morality, as expressed in the Ten Commandments, prepared the way for Jesus 1,000 years later, and it meant that Jesus did not have to devise a new morality in the land he called home, which is Judea. In other words, a lot of the groundwork had been laid for Jesus by the Old Testament. Very important. And the Old Testament's understanding of the prophecy about the coming of a Messiah is absolutely essential for Christianity, even though the Jewish understanding of the Messiah is not the same as the Christian understanding. Biblical morality is based on love your neighbor as yourself, and it's the same standard for Christians as for first century Jewish people. This is Judeo-Christian morality. The concept of Messiah is also very important, even though the two understandings are not the same. So, going back to our first lecture, from Christianity's point of view, the Old Testament, which I there called Act 1 of the cosmic drama, right, of the revelation of God to the world, the Old Testament prepared the way for Jesus. Jesus was Act 2. And then eventually, for the Holy Spirit, which is Act 3, Holy Spirit acting through the Holy Christian Church, the communion of saints. In other words, the Christian Church. Monotheism and morality are both highly sophisticated concepts. Monotheism immediately raises the problem of evil. If God is good, which we say, why does he allow evil to exist in the world? And the Bible's answer, in my understanding, is that God wants humans to have free will. And the moment you give humans free will, they have to have the right to do bad as well as good. And they tend to do bad rather than good, maybe. But humanity's downfall, whether one accepts the Bible or not, was the moment that humans could understand right or wrong. And in Genesis it says, by eating from the, quote, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's what caused all of humanity's problems. Okay? Humans ever since have been at the mercy of their human nature, meaning their internal psychological contradictions between selfishness and loving your neighbor as yourself. Selfishness or being cooperative and doing the right thing. And that insight has been verified now by modern evolutionary psychology. Now, our 4 time periods of Judaism. We must understand 4 separate and distinct time periods, and each of them have certain books of the Old Testament associated with them, and here they are. The 4 time periods are the prehistoric Judaism from creation to 1000 BC, Monarchy Judaism, that's the kings, from King David to Cyrus, from 1000 to 532 BC. Second Temple Judaism from 532 BC to 70 AD, and then Rabbinic Judaism from 70 AD to today. So those are the 4 time periods, but they're very different from each other in their historical accuracy, because we have very little historical information about prehistoric Judaism. We have a whole lot about the kings of Israel and the prophets. And then we have actually very little about Second Temple Judaism. Now, these were your readings for today. And we started with creation, the first 3 chapters of Genesis, the covenant with Abraham, the sacrifice of Isaac, the blessing of Jacob, the Exodus from Egypt, Moses at Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments, blessings and curses, death of Moses, and then the conquest of Jericho in Joshua chapter 6. We're not going to go through all of those readings, but they are important for the course, as I tell you regularly. Okay, prehistoric Judaism, this is the first time period. And that includes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the Exodus from Egypt, the conquest of Canaan, and the establishment of Israel. And it involves these books, prehistoric Judaism: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Those 8 books are covering that prehistory. And there is creation, there is the temptation. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are usually dated around 1700 BC. We cannot prove they existed, but that's where they would be for reasons we'll see. I asked you to read Joseph and his coat of many colors, which is there. And Joseph's summary is found in Genesis 50. This is when Joseph, who had been betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery after they decided not to kill him because they were so angry at him. And he has them in his power. He can execute them if he wanted to, because he's in charge of Egypt. And his brothers are scared, and he says to them, "Do not be afraid. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good. To me, that is almost the headline over the Old Testament. That God can work through bad things to accomplish good results. I'm sorry, Joseph is always emotional for me, so. Okay, the Israelites then lived in Egypt for 430 years, according to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. And then Moses led the Exodus from Egypt. Why is that important? Because there's a big gap, 430-year gap in the Bible. And then we get to Moses and the Exodus. The covenant had been made with Abraham, and this is a quotation, "Through you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And that's a universal one. We tend to think of Judaism as being ethnic specific, but that's universal. Here is Abraham's trip according to the Bible, the migration of Abraham. He started way over there in Ur of the Chaldees. The Chaldees are Babylon, and that's Babylon. And he goes up the Euphrates to Haran, H-A-R-A-N, in Syria, and then down into Israel, all the way to Jerusalem here. And he even goes into Egypt. His wife becomes temporarily a member of the Pharaoh's harem in Egypt. You can read about it in the Bible. And then comes back. Yeah, well, this is, I can't get in, if I stop and go into all of these interesting details, I won't get through my material. But read about it, you know, it's, anyway, Abraham had experienced Babylonian religion, Syrian religion, and Assyrian religion, the Canaanite religion, the Egyptian religion, and wound up back in Israel. According to the Bible, that's what it says. Then there's the sacrifice of Isaac, and then 430 years later, we get to Moses at the burning bush, right? Where he hears a voice calling him. And that voice, what's interesting about the voice is that it's a monotheistic voice. One God. It's not multiple. It's not polytheistic. And then there's the Exodus, you know, where they leave. They have the 10 plagues, and then they leave, and then the Pharaoh follows them, and the waters of the Red Sea split. And anyway, they get over to the land of Canaan, which is Israel. And but on the way, Moses gets the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. That's called the Sinai Covenant, made between God and the people of Israel. And so what is not scientifically established here? Well, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we don't have any scientific proof for their existence. There is, however, a time period in Egyptian history where they fit perfectly, called the Hyksos, H-Y-K-S-O-S, period, about 1700. And then you have Moses and the Exodus and conquest, and we don't have any evidence of that. Well, we have evidence of the conquest. Where is that? There. But we don't have direct evidence of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, or Moses. So 3 things stand out in the Old Testament: monotheism, morality, and Messiah. The Messiah, the prophecy that God would send an anointed one, a Messiah, to save his chosen people. And the people of the Jewish faith are still today waiting for that person. Every Passover Seder, how many of you have attended a Passover Seder? Anybody? Okay, a couple, good. Everyone has a cup for Elijah, because Elijah is the forerunner of the Messiah. That's part of every Passover Seder. And Christians, of course, understand the Messiah has already come and his name is Jesus. So these are the 4 time periods. And modern experimental science and the Old Testament explain scientifically what in the Old Testament is corroborated by modern science and what isn't. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Scientific corroboration is vital if you're talking to atheists or agnostics or skeptics, because if you attempt to discuss uncorroborated biblical information, you will have difficulty. And the Old Testament is particularly difficult because so much of the information depends on the science of biblical archaeology, which in fact, between the 7th and 8th classes, I'm going out to San Antonio to the annual Biblical Archaeology Conference. You know, that's just one of the things that I do. But here's the timeline of Judaism, and these are the 4 periods. And here's sort of the way it looks. The prehistoric period, we have a lot of information in the Bible with no corroboration. The monarchy Judaism, the kings, we have a lot of information and good corroboration. That's why I have it green. And then Second Temple Judaism, we have very little information and little corroboration. So when you get to the Second Temple, even though it's more recent, we don't have a lot of information. There's almost nothing in the Bible about Second Temple Judaism. One book of the Bible, Daniel, the book of Daniel. And because everything about the kings is in, here we are, is in the monarchy period, this period. And we got a lot of information about that. So here's what happened in monarchy Judaism, and I'm going through this because I want to show you how well documented it is. Monarchy Judaism in the First Temple, 1000 to 538. You had the unified monarchy of David, Solomon, from 1000 to 935, and then it splits in half, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Then the northern kingdom lasts until the Assyrian come in and wipe it off the map. The southern kingdom until the Babylonians, and then the Babylonian exile from 586 to 538. Now, Israel's monarchy, and this is going to be session 6, which is next week. Israel's monarchy is a sad story. There's the united monarchy. This is the high point. King David, King Solomon. From 1000 to 930, King Saul, David, Solomon. Then it splits, and the northern kingdom has 19 kings, and finally collapsed in 722 to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and it disappears from history, the north. The southern kingdom has 20 kings, and it lasts all the way to 586, when it's conquered by the Neo-Babylonian Empire and ends in the Babylonian exile. So we're going from the united monarchy downhill all the way to the exile. There's a large amount of corroboration of the information. The Bible refers repeatedly to specific records, such as the annals of the kings of Judah or the annals of the kings of Israel. And the 2 books in the Bible, 1st and 2nd Kings, also give the precise length of time each king was in office, often by relating them to the other kingdom. So it's all coordinated. And there are a number of references in the Bible to Egyptian pharaohs and Assyrian monarchs and Babylonian monarchs, which are consistent with the historical records we have from those countries. And we find references in the other countries to the kings of Judah and Israel in the Assyrian or Babylonian or Egyptian files, such as we have. Overall, the quality of historical accuracy with reference to the outside world is surprisingly high for the time period involved. Now, we're going to switch gears a little. The nation-state of ancient Israel was located in a tough neighborhood back then, in the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, surrounded by huge and powerful empires that rose and fell. It was an ugly place. As some of you are aware, it's still an ugly place. But, so this is, there's Israel, the red dot. There's Egypt. These are all the countries that conquered Israel. Okay? Egypt had ruled Israel. Assyria had ruled Israel. Babylon had ruled Israel. Persia had ruled Israel. Greece under Alexander. And Rome under the Caesars. All of this is the location they're in. You know, so the story of the Old Testament is very much about foreign policy to an extent greater than you would be expecting. Okay, now we're going to switch to what happened in the Exodus and Conquest period according to Biblical Archaeology, according to modern science. And now, what we're doing now is, because since I call this the entire Bible for everybody from atheists to Christian believers, we're trying to figure out what in this first section of the Bible, Genesis to 1 Samuel, is truth. That's what we're looking at. If you don't care for the science, just ignore it. Okay, here is the Exodus event about 1200 BC, about 200 years prior to the foundation of the state of Israel. And that time period between 1208 and 0 is a crazy time period. These are the two dates established: the first mention of Israel by a pharaoh of Egypt in 1208, and then the establishment of the nation-state of ancient Israel. What is not scientifically established? Well, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph, Moses, and the Exodus. We have no direct evidence. It doesn't mean they didn't happen, it just means we don't have any scientific. Then we have the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, about 1000 BC. And that 1208 date that I've told you about is this thing. It's an Egyptian king named Merneptah in 1208 putting up this monument, a 10-foot tall monument, writing the history about how he conquered an invasion of people. And by the way, just at the very end, he mentions this group of troublemakers called Israel. That is the first scientific evidence that there were a group of Israelites in the land of Canaan in 1208. Merneptah was a strong pharaoh. There were strong pharaohs and weak pharaohs. And in 1208 he defeated an invasion from Libya and some sea peoples. They were pirates. And he boasted of his success on that. That's Merneptah. So it's called the Merneptah Stele, the Merneptah Monument. Now there have been archaeological discoveries of the past 70 years, including dramatic discovery during the 1970s. Recent game-changing discoveries are the pertinent time period, 1208 to 1000, the first mention of Israel to the establishment of Israel. And in 1208, this is what the Middle East looked like. There were four huge empires. The Egyptian Empire, which went all the way up into Canaan and Phoenicia. The Hittite Empire in Turkey, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. The whole world, Middle East, was ruled by 4 rough, tough empires in 1208. And then they all collapsed. They all collapsed at once, which is still astonishing. Let me give you what Israel really looks like. Remember, I told you it's not flat. Whenever you look at Israel, you start with the Sea of Galilee up there, and then there's the Dead Sea, and that's the Jordan River. And Gaza, for those who care, is just off the map down here. But in ancient times, most of the people in Israel live in cities in the green area because that's the good agricultural land. And the much more difficult land is the brownish areas because that's the hills. You can see their hills, right? And this is called the Central Hill Country. That's called the Judean Hill Country, and Jerusalem is in between them. Now, the original Exodus story, the one we talk about, with Moses at the burning bush and going to Pharaoh, this, when the Jews wind up in Canaan, this is the land of Canaan, land of Israel, they are living up here in these areas. This is new knowledge from the 1970s, and it's going to become significant. And then there were the new discoveries of the 1970s. So we had the pertinent time period, 1208 to 1000. And in the middle of that, about halfway through, scientists discovered where the proto-Israelites were located in Canaan. Remember the ones that Pharaoh had defeated, supposedly? Proto-Israelites means the ancestors of the people that are going to found Israel. I know this is probably difficult, but the proto-Israelites, and where they were living, remember I showed you the hill country, those brownish hills? That's where they were discovered living in the middle of this period. They were living up in the hills, out of reach of the Egyptians. And here is the hills. That's the Central Hill Country. I'll get it there. The Central Hill Country there, the Judean Hill Country, and Jerusalem. Eventually, this will become the heartland of the Northern Kingdom and that of the Southern Kingdom. The 1970s discovery of the hill people was huge, hill country people, because until then, everybody was looking for the Israelites in the lowlands, where the Canaanites had been ruled by the Egyptians. But the hill country was not ruled by the Egyptians. In other words, the Egyptians had controlled this whole area up to Phoenicia and lorded it over the Canaanites. And meanwhile, there were people living up in the hill country, because that is very steep hill country. It's all bushy, there's no roads. And so the Israelites were living up there on their own in freedom, because the Egyptians didn't want to go up and try to bother them and get hurt. So all the big cities of Canaan were in the green area where the good land is, and the hill country is where the proto-Israelites, the ancestors of Israelites, were living independently, according to archaeology. And I call them the proto-Israelites, the ancestors. I call them the mysterious hill country people, because archaeology, even today, isn't sure where they came from. They think some came from the shore area, some came from settlers like nomads, and some came out of Egypt, the ones who eventually governed Israel. But this time period of 1208 was a time of anarchy and chaos, which is what allowed the Israelites to eventually conquer Israel. So these four empires collapsed. They collapsed soon after 1208. Middle East became chaos. And we also had the collapse of cuneiform in Canaan. Have anybody heard of cuneiform, the clay tablets? Okay, we've got some people. That's a cuneiform tablet, a clay tablet. That's a library of them, scholarly library. Today we have more than 170,000 of these cuneiform tablets from all over the Middle East. That's how we know almost everything from 3000 BC up to 1000. Because that's the way the empires of 1208 communicated with each other until the collapse. But when cuneiform is collapsing, the Phoenicians are inventing the Phoenician alphabet about 1050. Okay, suddenly there's a new form of writing, much simpler, coming. So at the time of the Exodus, cuneiform had collapsed and the alphabet was being invented by the Phoenicians, the country just north, called Lebanon, okay? Hezbollah, I guess in modern, where it is. The Proto-Israelites may well have been illiterate. They were living in farm country, and they certainly didn't have clay tablets and probably not paper. So here's what it looked like in the north. Here's the kingdom of Israel, and up there you can see Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Byblos. That's all Phoenicia, or today it's called Lebanon. And these are the Phoenician cities, which are big traders throughout the Mediterranean, and they're the ones who are inventing the alphabet. Cuneiform writing was very complicated, 600 symbols. Phoenician alphabet was just 22 characters, all consonants, standardized by about 1050. So we're right in the period before the formation of Israel. And the Phoenician alphabet and its derivatives, it came in about 1050, 22 consonants. The Hebrew is about 200 years later, standardized, with 22 consonants, no vowels. That's about the time of Amos. And the Phoenician alphabet is the source of all three biblical languages, which are Hebrew, Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, and we talked about that a little bit, and the Greek language of the New Testament. All of them have 22 consonants. 3 of them have no vowels, and the Greeks added vowels to get to approximately what we have today. All of this is happening at the same time. It makes it very difficult to try to keep it straight. If you're interested, I have a 2-hour lecture on YouTube called the Exodus, What Really Happened. If you got interested, you could look at that. So anyway, the Phoenicians invented the Phoenician alphabet. The Exodus story was written in the Hebrew language later, and if the Exodus event happened, because scholars are disagreeing, it happened before 1100, there were probably no written records. And this is the pertinent time period. The Exodus event, I refer to it as the sudden deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian oppression by extraordinary occurrences. Because something very real did happen. Scholars are not sure what it was. The big thing that happened in archaeology in the 1970s, when the hill country became accessible to archaeologists, was surface surveys that discovered the existence and extent of the proto-Israelites, who I call the mysterious hill country people. Now, if you say, well, why did it happen in the 1970s and not much earlier? The answer is called the 1967 Six Days War between Israel and Jordan and Egypt, in which the Israelites gained possession of the West Bank, which is still a major issue, as you probably know. Okay, the mysterious hill country people in detail. And I say they are truly a fascinating people. These are the ancestors that are going to found Israel like 100 years later. They were destined to have a huge impact on the history of Western civilization, right? Monotheism, morality, Messiah. They can be credited with monotheism, Western morality, the concept of Messiah, and the freedom story. And yet their most fascinating aspect to me is their egalitarianism. You know what everybody treated equally is egalitarianism. These people living up in that hill country were living entirely on their own. They had no government. They had no public, well, this will go into. They were very different from everybody else because the Egyptians, the Philistines, and the Canaanites all lived in what are called stratified societies. Rich, poor. Rich people lived in palaces, poor people lived in hovels. The hill country people were the opposite. No palaces, no fancy pottery, no cities, no temples, everybody equal. They were forced to look out for each other. They had no one to protect them. This is the group living in the hills. Now, later on, we know that the Israelite prophets constantly stressed social justice issues, equality, treat your neighbor as yourself. And by the 1st century AD, we find Judaic morality stressing the need to love your neighbor as yourself, as did the Christians. I want to talk about these hill country people because I'm going to start with their houses because this is fascinating. During the monarchy, which is after 1000, and this is what scholars knew about before the 1970s, most Israelites lived in a type of house called the, quote, Israelite four-room house. From 1000 BC until the Babylonian exile, over 400 years, that's the kind of house they lived in. And then the mysterious hill country were discovered in the 1970s living in farmhouses, which were, surprise, Israelite four-room houses. So the origin of this Israelite four-room house, which scholars had known about during the city period, after Israel was formed, was originally a farmhouse up in the hill country. The moment scholars saw those houses in the hill country, they knew what they were. They were Israelite houses. Here's an Israelite four-room house. It's a little complicated, but there's a room at the back across the width, and then there's a room on each side and an open area. Here's another one, you can see it better. There's a room there, and then this is a roof shot. That's the open area, and then a room across the back. Note that it's a two-story structure. That's what the pillars were for. And we believe the people lived up on the second floor. Farming techniques in the hill country was very difficult to farm. Water was in short supply. This is still true today. Most of the year's rainfall came in 2 months, December and January. So they had to master the water situation by storing water in cisterns lined with lime. And they used terraced farming to save precious water and underground grain silos lined with rocks. There's terraced farming. They had food taboos. The hill country people avoided pork. The Canaanites in general ate very little. However, for the Philistines, pork was an important food. And the percent of pig bones in the Philistine area was between 5% and 20%. Archaeologists count the number of bones, cattle, lambs, goats, and pigs. And this is the percentage. In other Canaanite areas, about 1%. In the hill country, it was essentially 0. Their pottery was very plain and utilitarian, very different from the Philistines and Canaanites. That's typical, fancy pottery. Israelite pottery is very religious information. Very little is known about the hill country. But the Canaanites and Philistines had temples and impressive tombs. The hill country people had no temples and so far no tombs. So they're a fascinating people, destined to have a large impact. And the egalitarianism. And now I'm going to stop. Have I totally confused you? Well, this is what we've discovered, and it explains a lot of things to me about why the ancient Israelites and then the later Jews were so concerned about social justice and egalitarianism. Because that was their DNA from before living in the hill country. And then they came in, we're going to find out that they had to get organized to fight the Philistines, which is what Saul and David did. And so, but even so, they carried this tradition of egalitarianism. Okay, we define Exodus event as the deliverance of Israelites from Egyptian oppression due to extraordinary occurrences. There is definite archaeological evidence suggesting that an Exodus event did really occur. At this point, we're still, scientists are still trying to figure it out. Okay. In other words, there's a good explanation why it might not match up with the story in Exodus in detail. This is a bibliography. These are, this is the early history of the alphabet. Well, this is sort of interesting. What happened between 1208 to 1000 to 1100, which was the Egyptians collapsed, the Philistines attacked, settled in 5 cities, became Egyptian mercenaries to control the Canaanites. They came from the Aegean Sea area, and they added 25,000 immigrants with pigs. Pig is a big food in Greece, in the Aegean Sea area. And what happened? The Philistines invaded in 1177. And these are the 5 Philistine cities at the southern end: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. There's Jerusalem over there. And the 5 Philistine cities, you see the dotted line there? For the dotted line, the 5 Philistine cities are within the dotted line. That's where all the pig bones are. And the rest of Judah or Israel have very few pig bones. There was a cultural break there. And I'm not going to interpret it further. People are quick to say, well, that the Jewish taboo against pork or the Muslim is very much due to this. I'm just going to But that really is a line that scholars can see about where the pig bones are. The Philistines were pig bone eaters. Then we have, this is 1208, I've already, we talked about all of this except there was a huge increase in population in this period from an unknown source or sources, which you're welcome to interpret in any way you want. I would say Jews and Christians would generally interpret as coming from Egypt, the people from Moses. And these are the populations, Egyptian troops. The hill country people in 1208 were about 3,000, whereas by 1100 there's about 25,000. A huge influx of the hill country people from unknown source or sources. And then starting in 1100s, the Philistines, see the red arrows start expanding to the north and to the east, which brings them into conflict with the Israelites and the Canaanites. And so, but here's what you want to know. After the Egyptians pulled out of Canaan, there was a three-way struggle between the Philistines, the Canaanites, and the Israelites. And the Israelites won. Okay? And that's how Israel was established. So the Egyptians' empire collapsed. The Philistines had come in. They were used as mercenaries. This is Ramesses III, another strong pharaoh. And then Ramesses III gets assassinated by the harem conspiracy. The women in his harem organized a conspiracy, killed him, and at that point, Egypt collapsed. I'm sure you're loving this, right? You could Google harem conspiracy. You'll find out all about it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Session number 5. For detailed information about the period 1208 BC to 1000 BC, see my YouTube video, The Exodus Story and Modern Archaeology, What Really Happened. It is 1 hour and 47 minutes long. The key dates for Pharaoh Shoshank, he invaded Israel in 925 BC. That was 5 years after Solomon died, according to the Bible. And so Solomon's 40-year reign would be about 970 BC to 930 BC, and David's 40-year reign from about 1010 BC to about 970 BC. Additional evidence from the 1970s discovery of Israelite ancestors living in the hill country of Canaan before 1000 BC, the confirmation of the dynasty of David from the Tel Dan Stele, and the finding of Kirbet Kiatha, a recently discovered fortress on the Israel-Philistine border about 1000 BC. This has been the entire Bible for everybody from atheist to Christian believers, session number 5, Introduction to the Old Testament.